And now we are moving on to the central section of our debate. And we are going to listen to the presentations of the 8 of our absolutely brilliant speakers. But before we start, I'd remind that we have 20 minutes for each presentation. I will be extremely grateful for respecting this timing because we are already slightly out of schedule. And I have a huge privilege to introduce our first speaker, Professor Yaroslav Hrytsak, Ukrainian historian, public intellectual, professor at the Ukrainian Catholic University. And given the topic of his presentation, it can be considered as a keynote speech because the title is The European Roots of Ukrainian Identity. Professor Hrytsak, you are welcomed.
Your Excellency, Director of the Institute of thank you very much for this conference. It's a great pleasure to be on this conference. And I want to extend my gratitude in the name of my colleagues, or name of the university, for what you has been done and doing during this year, because this is war of extension, attrition, and the war attrition, the external help is extremely important, so to say. And we appreciate very much what you've done during your period. Thank you so much. Let me just remind you that this year is a 40th anniversary of the very famous text. Text was written by the Milan Kundera, Tragedy of Europe, has been published by the end of April 1884 in New York Review of Books. And this article discusses the fate of this large region between Berlin and Moscow, the tragedy of these people who found themselves caught between Berlin and Moscow, most of the Hungarians, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, all the people. And basically they see this kind of the portrait history as a kidnapped by Russia. And there is one mention of Ukraine there, which is very interesting, but it's in footnote number 3, which basically says that, look, what happened to Ukraine? This is a biggest European nation of 40 million that disappeared before our eyes. And this is exactly what Kremlin does to local people. And he saw at that moment, this is exactly the threat that Hungarians, Slovaks, and Czechs and other people facing if they will remain within the power of the Soviet Union. What I mean to say here, 40 years ago, it looked like there is no Ukrainian identity. It is already project done. I know some academicians, very famous, like Karl Deutsch, who said that basically you see this kind of project that Belarus and Ukraine ceased to exist as a nation. It was end of the 80s, so to say. And quite a sudden, 40 years later, we see this very strong identity. And to solve this puzzle, there is one very simple explanation. Explanation is that identity is always seen during the time of crisis. When the peaceful time, it seems like there's no Ukrainian identity, so to say. When it comes to the real crisis, so to say, it's there. So a very short formula of Ukrainian history, now you see me, now you don't. For the peaceful time, you seem that Ukraine is not existing. But then comes the time of crisis, is it the First World War or the Second World War or fall of the communism, it's there. So my claim is that all the times that Ukrainian identity is featuring very much, it's featuring because it's connection with European culture, most importantly with political culture, so to say. And just to give a very short illustration to that, this is one of my hobby. I like very much Christmas carols. I hope that one day I will write a book on that. And this is a melody I believe that most people don't know. That's really the idea. But more importantly, that is the kind of the rendering of the spirit in the faith. The mother, faith, Christ, the message is to be happy when they take time for a faithful. It was the emphasis this can be grounded as a symbol of those reasons, political, the more physical history. Well, think about the Syria, where they sacrificed their life for their. So in a sense, this is kind of essence. You probably know the Spanish book, I think. There's a said that crucial would be briefly defined by Van Gogh the whole point. The thing goes together, but also build. This would be so that's what people here. But basically, the mistake would be that my brain is without limitation of the also zone of the intensity of Ukrainian identity. Also the usage of Ukrainian language, and very importantly, the most recent political divisions during the parliamentary and presidential elections. So what I'm seeing here, history matters. History is very, very deeply, because basic identity is very much long-term processes which are shaped by history itself. Then you have to have a historian to explain this kind of difference. Another very visual moment, it is quite often if you go just directly to center of the city, which is a typical Magdeburg city law, by the way, which is a typical Italian literature, architecture. It was kind of very fine, nice story, because there was great conflagration in the city. City has been destroyed to the zero level in 1527. And it was a kind of tragedy. Since then, they started to build in the stone only. But the timing was very good, because Renaissance was in the air. And the city was very rich. So they buy the best architects they could afford, and this was Italian architecture. Therefore, we have this kind of famous place like Paolo di Roma. And basically, they build a beautiful Italian Renaissance city, which has according to Magdeburg law, which is the very much German system. But the main core of this issue is the self-governance. And the Ukraine, if you look at the most of the histories of the large Ukrainian city, it's very much according into Magdeburg law. It's not story of Lviv. Lviv was the most visible illustration, because Lviv has this kind of center which has been not destroyed by the First and the Second World War, unlike other cities. But you have all the kind of symbols in Kyiv. Kyiv also has the Magdeburg law. It's a monument for the Magdeburg law, which is established in the very center of the city. More so, probably the largest eastern city which has still Magdeburg law was Poltava, which is practically on the verge of nowadays Polish-Ukrainian-Russian war. And I just returned from Dnipro, and I was kind of funny, because I found at the very center of the city, you probably know, there is a large Jewish synagogue, menorah, and it stands on the cross of the Siver of Shalom Aleichem and the Magdeburg. Even Dnipro, they're celebrating Magdeburg because it's something very essential for their identity. It's not kind of trifle, it's very important things. And let me just remind you, at the very beginning of the war, there was a large discussion among military experts. What would happen if, God forbid, Zelensky would be assassinated at the very beginning of the war? You know, there were several attempts, probably 9 attempts during the First War to assassinate him, so to say. And there was a very much professional military discussion because you know that as in Romans, in war, the first days are very important. So basically, discussion and the conclusion that it will be a tragedy for Zelensky, his family, and probably for Ukraine, but it won't change essentially the character of the war. Because, and this was explanation, because every large cities in Ukraine, mayor of every large city act as a Zelensky. They didn't expect some kind of comments from the above. So this is basically the idea. It's very much rooted in the history, in the Magdeburg Law, because idea is there, self-rule. We don't depend on anybody, we depend on ourselves. And in a sense, this is very much idea of Ukrainian identity. As His Excellency just mentioned, at the beginning of the war, Putin made this kind of this famous or infamous statement. And I would say to a large extent, this war could be defined as a war about past, because most of arguments Putin provides to legitimize his aggression is of historical character. And most importantly, he says that Rus is existing on this territory at least 1,000 years, which is very much kind of nonsense, because basically what is really characterized this kind of history of Eastern Europe. And in a sense, this is something similar to Italy, but not to the rest of Europe, I would say. I hate to say it. In a sense, there's no continuity in this region. There is hardly one state that existed here, the story more for the 300 years. In this sense, Soviet Union was one of the shortest ones, so to say, because there's a large discontinuity. There's not, at least between the beginning of the state building in this territory, which was the end of 19th century, 19th century Rus, and the nowadays, at least 30 states, which was claiming control over this territory. There's no discontinuity. Therefore, what Putin does, he just destroys this kind of image, because he tries to consider this kind of continuity as direct link between Rus and Russia, which is non-existent. But secondly, and more importantly, if you look on the Rus, the starting point of this territory, the written history, so to say, and Putin claimed this is Russia. And one of the claims he is Russia because he believed at the very beginning it was Orthodox country, which was against the Catholic Europe. So basically, he presents, since Russia is very much anti-Western, at the very beginning, Rus was also very anti-Western. And this doesn't reflect the historical reality, because if you see on the network of marriages of Kyiv prince and their kids, their sons and daughters, it's essentially they married to the West, to the Catholic West. 77% of all marriages were to Britain, France, Holy Roman Empire, which is nowadays Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Poland. Only few of them were to Byzantium, and only few of them were to the east, so to say. So this is the idea. From the very beginning, Rus, this territory, was an essential part, natural part of Europe, if we define Europe by that term, that time, which is Christianity. At that time, division between East and West was not essential, it became only later. But exactly this emergence of Russian Empire. At that time, difference was very much negligent, and I saw you this kind of carol, or in the Magdeburg Law, this is the same space. If we could focus on Cossacks, because as you know well, Cossacks are considered as the main symbol of Ukrainian identity, and there is a national anthem claims that all Ukrainians of the Cossack kin, and this is kind of also irony because we have Cossacks practically everywhere in this territory. We have a Ukrainian Cossack, also Russian Cossacks. We have a Don Cossack, we have E Cossacks, all possible Cossacks, because per se Cossack is not national, it's a military organization. But here's the trick. You could easily write Russian history without Russian Cossacks. And most of the Russian history doesn't even mention Cossacks, because most of the Russian history is history of the state, История государства российского. It's written from top down. It's history of rulers. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Stalin, Putin, name it, so to say. But you could really mention the history of the Russian society. As a matter of fact, the irony is that even the Russian historians say that actually there is no history of Russia per se, because history of rulers, rarely history of society. So by this token, you could easily write history of Russia without Russian Cossacks. You cannot write Ukrainian history without Ukrainian Cossacks, because Ukrainian Cossacks is written from bottom up. And the crucial elements are the Cossacks. And the Cossack symbol identity, not just like a Russian Cossacks, because this identity is something which is very much European. Let's give me this example. Because if you look at the history of the Ukrainian Cossacks, especially Cossack state, and their leaders, you could tell many things about them, both pleasant and unpleasant, but the thing is that most of them has been alumni of Jesuit colleges, which means they learn Latin, they could speak Latin, they write a poetry in Latin, they could read some other languages, and probably one of the most interesting case that could be referred here, that one of the most famous Ukrainian hetman leader was Ivan Mazepa, who fluently read Italian. Why we know that? Because he is Machiavelli prince in his library, so to say. You could hardly find Russian Cossack leader who could read Machiavelli, or even any kind of the Western text. What I mean to say here, because this gives the idea that most of Ukrainian identity is based on the Orthodox identity of Rus, but under influence of European culture. To put it differently, Ukraine is the most westernized part of the Orthodox world, and this makes exactly the point of Ukrainian identity. But my claim, it extends just cultural things. It has a very deep political implication, because it also defines a specific political culture. We could criticize Europe for many things, and there's many black pages in the European past, without a doubt. Colonization, all the kind of things, war, all the kind of, but there is one project which I believe is essentially European. It's a rule of law, which is a really invention of Europe. In a sense, it's a part of larger project, I would say emancipation project. Because if you see the history of Europe in the last, 2,000 years, it's a gradual emancipation of new groups, social groups, slaves, serfs, women. Now they say that probably the next group that will be liberated from this will be probably animals, from zoos and circus, so to say. But what I'm seeing here, this is about rule of law. In a sense, the idea of Europe very much so is to put a ruler below the law, not above the law. This is an essential principle. So what I'm saying is exactly the part of this problem. Because how Ukrainian historians define difference between Ukraine and Russia? They say that the biggest difference between Russia is not in language per se. As a matter of fact, Ukrainian and Russian language, they're mutually comprehensive. By that token, I have to say that the closest language to Ukraine is not Russian, but Belarusian, because Belarusian in sense share the same destiny as Ukraine, with this kind of the European contact. But anyway, the difference between European and Russian, their dialects are probably not that big as a difference between many German dialects in this large realm between Baltic Sea and Switzerland. Also, there is not that big difference in terms of the religion, because both the countries, there's Eastern Christian country. So there's similarity, and this similarity helps Putin and other leaders to define that there is no Ukraine, because they're very much similar. What I'm saying, essential difference is political culture. And this political culture is that there are different kinds of relations between state and society. Because the state is not a kind of seen as an absolute sacred, so to say, image, so to say, that state could be criticized, could be faced. And there is society which is self-organized and is have a sense of dignity. In a sense, Ukrainian identity is very much rooted in the idea of the dignity as a human being, as a citizen. So in a sense, there is a very strong message of citizenship in the Ukrainian identity throughout the last several centuries. So this is a claim again and again. This is something that has to be conveyed in many things, that this is more political difference. Could be put very simple version. You could hardly imagine Ukrainian Stalin or Putin, and vice versa. You could hardly imagine victorious Maidan in Moscow. There were attempts to confront Putin. There was the famous protest on the Bolotny Street, but still they failed. And this provides you some kind of the very important difference. So, if I may come to some conclusion, again and again, I'm saying that in the core of the difference between Ukraine and Russia is the European impact. I would deny that to say that Russia is not a European country. It is. without a doubt. And the Russian culture is very much European culture. But this is culture which is presented by a very thin strata of population, so to say. Mostly, but they're intellectuals. Whether they appeal or not doesn't matter, but they're really brilliant, but very thin. And this culture doesn't trickle down to society itself, because society is still very much different. And it's vice versa. Probably Ukrainian culture is not much that sophisticated because it was colonized, but it go much deeper into society and everyday practices, so to say, and every kind of remembrance. So what I'm saying here, let me just conclude with this famous statement by quoting the famous statement by German President Weizsäcker. On the first 40th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, he said that the best thing that happened to Germany, that it's lost the war. So I would say that the best thing that could happen to Russia, that it would lost the war, because this would create a chance. I would say the biggest tragedy of Eastern Europe, that from variety of scenarios, varieties of the countries with this territory, the kind of the consolidation political national this territory was by the end of the day was controlled by the less European, the further European countries, both in geography and political, and this was Russia. We tend to forget that there were some other scenarios. A part of the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian scenario, there was a fourth scenario, and the scenario was Novgorod Republic, which is also one of the largest European formation in this territory, all Baltic states, Hanseatics, all the kind of things. The tragedy of this territory that was devoured, destroyed by Russia, so to say. So what I'm saying here, that there is a recent study done by groups of Ukrainian, Belarusian, Polish, and Russian historians on the nation building in this territory. And basically they say that nation building in all the kind of cases started more or less at the same time, 16th, 17th century. That will make difference between Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians. This is more or less simultaneous process. But there is one crucial difference, that Russian nation building failed from the very beginning, because the Russian nation was devoured by the Russian Empire. And therefore, they don't have a kind of symbol of this Russian identity as identity of citizens, but rather as identity of subjects. And this is again and again the crucial difference in this kind of the story. So I'm saying here that for historians, it's very relatively easily to explain this kind of things. But I believe more important than explain is to show it on the front line, because this is what defines the past, present, and the future of European project as a large emancipation project, of which Ukraine is a very essential part. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hrytsak, for providing this very substantial, very important outline perspective, both historical and cultural, and it will be a kind of space where we can move on